Assalamu alaikum. Today we are going to talk about food chains and the food webs. Food chains are actually the flow of energy or flow of food from one level of the biotic factors to another level of the biotic factors. Food chain is, we can say, a one-way flow of energy in the form of foods. Food webs are the networks of feeding relationships, the relationships between different trophic levels and the relationships between within different trophic levels. A network of eating and being eaten is present inside an ecosystem. So we are going to talk about the food chains and food webs. But before going to the food chains and food webs, we have to look at the ecosystem and its biotic components briefly. Then we will talk about the food chains and the food webs. Ecosystem. Ecosystem is an area in which the biotic factors, the living organisms, are present in interaction with each other and in interaction with their surroundings, with their non-living surroundings. We call it an ecosystem. Biotic factors, the living organisms, which are interacting with each other and which are also interacting with their physical and chemical surroundings. Ecosystems, there are many kinds of ecosystems. We widely divide them into two major categories: the aquatic ecosystems and the terrestrial ecosystems. Aquatic ecosystems, ecosystems present inside the water. Terrestrial ecosystems, ecosystems present on land. So ecosystems could be present in water, that is, organisms living in water interact with each other, and they interact with the water, and they interact with other physical surroundings. Organisms living in terrestrial ecosystems of different kinds, and they are also interacting with each other, and they are also interacting with their physical surroundings and their chemical surroundings. We call them ecosystem. Ecosystem have biotic factors. We are talking about only biotic factors, though ecosystem consists of biotic factors and the abiotic factors. Biotic factors, the living factors, the living parts of the ecosystem, the plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, viruses, all of the living components of the ecosystem. The abiotic factors, though, are equally important because biotic factors, the living organisms, depend upon the physical factors, the abiotic factors, like sunlight. As we know that sunlight is the only source of energy in the ecosystem, and all of the energy which is circulating inside the biosphere is coming through sunlight. Water. Water is also an abiotic factor, but we know that this is extremely important for the living life forms because no life can exist without water. Rain is a very important physical factor. Soil is a very important physical factor because soil supports living organisms. The trees, the plants, they grow and exist in the soil. So abiotic factors are equally important than that of biotic factors. But because we are concerned here with food chains and food webs, so we will concentrate more on biotic factors. The biotic factors consist of living organisms. We categorize them according to their feeding levels or the trophic levels into producers, consumers, and the decomposers. Producers, the plants, algae, photosynthetic bacteria, phytoplanktons, all of the living organisms that have the capability of utilizing sunlight as energy source and converting that sunlight energy into the chemical form of energy called the adenosine triphosphate, ATP, and also through a process called photosynthesis, and also through another process called Calvin cycle. to produce carbohydrates, which are the first organic carbon molecules inside an ecosystem. Because all of the other life forms, the animals and the other organisms, they depend upon that organic carbon. Then comes the consumers, the second part of biotic factors, which eat upon and they get their or acquire their energy mainly or primarily from eating plants. They are called consumers because they can consume plants initially, or then other animals consume animals, or we say eat animals, but those animals which are being eaten are actually eating the plants. So ultimately they have to consume animals and then plants. Consumers consist mainly of animals. Consumers have their own types, the herbivores, the carnivores, and the omnivores. Then the decomposers. Decomposers also have extremely important role because these are the organisms who have to break down the dead organic matters. That is, they decompose the dead organic matter and convert it into very small molecules and compounds, and these compounds are taken up, or we can say eaten up by the plants, and plants then use them for their life processes. So energy which was coming through plants come to the consumers, come to the decomposers, and then go back towards the plants. Biotic factors, they are in relationship with each other. Biotic factors are also in interaction with the abiotic factors. The feeding relationship between the biotic factors is called a food chain. If there is a straight feeding relationship, we call it a food chain. If there is a complex feeding relationship, we call it a food web. So there are three major trophic levels: producers, the plants, the algae, the photosynthetic protista, unicellular organisms, photosynthetic bacteria, the consumers, which consist of different types of animals, plant-eating animals, the meat-eating animals, then the decomposers, the third level, which are fungi, different types of bacteria, and some different types of worms like earthworm. So trophic level consists of producers, consumers, decomposers. We also briefly talk about pyramids in an ecosystem. When we are looking at trophic levels, we always make pyramids. Pyramids are actually conical diagrams which shows the relationship between different feeding levels. The producers always come at the base. They are maximum in numbers. They produces energy and they produces carbohydrates for all other life forms. Then comes the consumers, less than in number than producers because they have to consume the producers. Then the decomposers, which have to decompose both the producers and the consumers. The bacteria, the fungi, they are usually more or less in terms of numbers, more or less in comparison to producers and the consumers. Producers, we call them autotrophs. Autotrophs, self-feeding. These are the organisms which makes their own food by using sunlight as the energy source. They convert carbon dioxide and water into carbohydrates. Carbon dioxide, the inorganic form of carbon. The producers are the only source of all organic food present on the planet Earth. We also call them the entry point of energy in an ecosystem. They provide food to all other organisms, to all life forms. Examples of the autotrophs, the producers, includes the plants, algae, photosynthetic protista, photosynthetic bacteria. Next level is the heterotrophs. Heterotrophs. Heterotrophs are the organisms which are also called the consumers. Heterotrophs mean that they are not able to make their own food. and they have to acquire food from the environment, usually through the autotrophs. Heterotrophs, the animals particularly, these are the organisms that do not make their food. They get their food from other organisms. They can get their food from other autotrophs, that is, other organisms which are autotrophs, the producers, the herbivores, which have to eat upon other types of plants, different types of plants, maybe leaves of a tree, maybe grasses directly, maybe different parts of the plant, maybe fruits, maybe nuts, beans, or legumes, anything else from plant, that is, anything which is of plant origin. They may get their food or energy by eating other animals. Now, other animals may be the herbivores, that is, plant eaters. Those animals may be carnivores, themselves flesh eaters. For example, the lions, the leopards, cats, they are all carnivores and they are also heterotrophs. There is another category of organisms which are called the chemotrophs. Chemotrophs, which make their food from chemicals. These are very specific life forms. These organisms uses inorganic chemicals as their energy source and make carbohydrates. These are usually present in those areas of the ecosystem where light, the sunlight, do not penetrate. For example, very deep zone of a lake, deeper zones of the ocean, where light do not penetrate, light cannot penetrate inside, and photosynthesis is not possible. These organisms stays there. They have some specific metabolic pathways and enzymes. With the help of these enzymes and the metabolic pathways, they utilizes the energy present in inorganic chemicals and convert it into ATP, the chemical form of energy, and also makes organic molecules, the carbohydrates. We call them chemotrophs. Examples are some chemotrophic bacteria. There are different types of bacteria that live their life like this. And there are some deep sea worms which are also chemotrophs, and they produces their food through inorganic chemicals. Then there are types of consumers. Consumers are herbivores if they are plant eaters. For example, the goats, the sheep, the giraffes, very large huge animals. We see giraffes actually eats up the plants of the leaves of very tall plants because they are too high. The elephants, some ancient dinosaurs were also herbivore. Then comes the carnivores, the secondary consumers, which are, we also call them primary carnivores because they eat upon the herbivores. The frogs and snakes are very common examples. We know that the insects, many of the insects and the dragonflies, for example, they eat upon the grasses or they eat upon different plant parts. And the frogs, they are insect eaters. They eat upon those insects. So frogs are very common secondary consumers or primary carnivores. Snakes are another example of primary carnivores. Usually the different types of rodents, the mice, the rats, they eat upon grains and they eat upon grasses, they eat upon different types of plant materials, and the snakes consume those rodents. So snakes are acting as the primary carnivores or the secondary consumers. Then the tertiary consumers are the secondary carnivores. These are the organisms which eat upon the secondary consumers or the primary carnivores. For example, the hawks and the eagles. Hawks usually eat upon the frogs. And we know that frogs eat upon the insect and insect eat upon the grass. So the secondary carnivores or the tertiary carnivores, they actually eat upon the another type of carnivore. Eagle is another example. Eagles eat snakes eat upon the rats or mice, and the rats and mice eat upon the grasses or the plant parts. So eagles are another example of the secondary carnivores. A goat, in a picture you can see a goat eating upon grass. Goat is a herbivore because it eats grass. Grass is a plant producer. You can see a cat. Cat is a carnivore. It usually eats upon meat. It's a meat eater. But we know that nowadays cats became a sort of omnivore because people give them food and they take that food in different forms. Like even sometimes cats, they eat the rice, which is plant material. You can see a squirrel which is eating upon nuts, parts of the plant again, so it's a herbivore. Then the decomposers. Decomposers eats dead organic matter, animals and plants, their fallen parts, the dead organisms. We know that various plants shed their leaves and their branches in the fall. These leaves and branches go towards the soil and then they are merged into the soil. The decomposers, bacteria or fungi present in that soil, eat upon those dead organic matters and help the environment in a way that they convert those larger parts which are actually present in the soil, present on the soil or in the soil, but are not available for acquiring any types of nutrients by plants or animals. The decomposers eat them and break them down into smaller parts, into smaller compounds. And these compounds are then taken up by the roots of the plants and they become part of the plant. And when animals eat plant, they go back to the animal. So in this way, the decomposers let the energy present in the ecosystem flow from soil towards the plants. For example, we know that some plants have nodules like legumes. These plants have nodules around in their roots, and there are bacteria which are associated with those nodules. These bacteria can fix nitrogen in the surrounding soil for these plants. There are different types of fungi which are present on the soil, or there are different types of other bacteria present in the soil which can convert the dead bodies of the organisms or the fallen parts of plant into smaller compounds, compounds of nitrogen like ammonia, nitrates and nitrites, which are later on taken up by the roots of the plants, and plants use them for making their structures. And when these structures are eaten by the animals like leaves, stem, or some other part, fruit, then this energy, or we can say these compounds, go to the animals and they also use them for their life processes. With all this background, we talk about the food chains. Food chains are a one-way flow of energy. Food chain is a flowchart diagram that shows the flow of energy from one biotic component of an ecosystem to another, and then to another, and then to another, and so on. So food chain is actually a relationship between different trophic levels or different biotic factors within an ecosystem. If we simply exemplify a food chain, then this will be from producers eaten up by the consumers, consumers eaten up by the decomposers. In an ecosystem, different types of food chains exist. This is actually a relationship of eating and being eaten. In an ecosystem, we know that different types of organisms are present. Various types of plants, various types of animals, and many of these animals are herbivores, many of these animals are carnivores. There are different types of plants, and because different types of animals will eat upon different types of plants, and some other types of animals will eat upon those animals. So in an ecosystem, not many types of food chains they do exist. And as we know that ecosystems, they are very different from each other. And all those ecosystems have different types of biodiversity. So in different types of ecosystems, different types of food chains, they do exist. We'll talk about a few examples from various ecosystems of different types of food chains. Let us have a look on the slide of a food chain. You can see in the slide that initially there is a plant, there is a worm which eat upon this dead plant. Then this worm is eaten up by the turtle. There are turtles in the environment which eat upon these worms, and turtles are themselves eaten by the eagles. It makes a straight relationship. That is, producer, the plant, eaten by a worm. Worm is a consumer that is eaten by the turtle. Turtle itself is a consumer, but a secondary consumer, which is eaten by the eagle, which is then, in this way, we call it a tertiary consumer. This is a straight generalized food chain. Now we talk about some specific food chains in some specific ecosystems. We talk about first a grassland ecosystem. We have to look at few properties of the grassland ecosystems. Grasslands, which are other way, we can call them vast land, vast areas on which grass or grass-like plants they do exist. हम इन्हें कुदरती चरागाहें भी कहते हैं. The grassland ecosystems have some characteristics. The rainfall in these ecosystems is from 250 to 750 millimeters annually. This is not a sufficient rainfall. The result is that water is a crucial factor, or we can call water a limiting factor. Water is a factor that limits life because water is required by the plants and animals. So specific group of plants or animals can grow here which can conserve water well and which have properties which help them to live in with smaller quantities of water. Plants which lives in the grassland, which can flourish in the grasslands, are the tall and short grasses. We can say the grass family, plants from grass family, tall grasses, short grasses. Then legumes, जो फलीदार पौधे होते हैं, वो पौधे जिनकी फलियां होती हैं. And the legumes, the leguminous plants, they grow well in these areas. The herbs, small plants, the mosses and lichens. These are the common inhabitants of a grassland ecosystem. Animals, they are present in these ecosystems which can survive with lesser quantities of water, which have specific adaptations to conserve water and to live with fewer water. Animals which flourish in these ecosystems, they are the reptiles, the amphibians, and different types of mammals. Decomposers, as in all the ecosystems, are part of this ecosystem, and these are mainly the fungi and the bacteria. Let us have a look on a grassland food chain. In a grassland, diagram shows that the source of the energy is sunlight, which is coming through producers inside the ecosystem. There are plants which gets energy from the sunlight and convert this energy into ATP, the chemical form of energy, and into the carbohydrates to make their body and to make their life processes possible. Then you can see a mole or a rat, a rodent, the primary consumer. These are common in these ecosystems, and they eat upon the producers, the grasses, the leguminous plants. They eat upon the nuts, they eat upon the leaves and other parts of the grasses. So we call them primary consumers. These are the herbivores. Then the primary consumers are eaten up by the snakes. We know that reptiles inhabit the grasslands. Snake is a reptile. Snakes eat upon these rodents. So we call the snakes secondary consumers. In grasslands, snakes are very common, and they eat upon, and of course the moles and shrews, they are also very common. The snakes eat upon these moles, shrews, or the rats, other types of rodents. Then there are hawks present in these ecosystems, or there are eagles present in these ecosystems, which eat upon the snakes. So we call them tertiary consumers, because these hawks or the eagles, they are getting their energy by acquiring a snake from the environment, and snake itself is a secondary consumer. So we call it, the hawk, a tertiary consumer. We also call it a secondary carnivore because it is eating a primary carnivore. Snake is a primary carnivore because it is eating herbivore animal, that is a mole or a rat. So secondary consumer is a primary carnivore, and the tertiary consumer is a secondary carnivore. As you can see that all of these organisms, so this is a food chain, that is producer, a grass plant, primary consumer, a rat, maybe another rodent, the secondary consumer, the snake, and the tertiary consumer, the hawk. So energy actually is flowing unidirectionally from sunlight to the plant, the producer, from producer to the primary consumer, the mole or the rat, from primary consumer to secondary consumer because it is eating the primary consumer and utilizing it, then to the tertiary consumer, the hawk. Then all of these organisms, when they die, or plants, for example, they shed their some parts, they become part of the soil, the land. And here comes the decomposers. There are different types of insects, worms, and bacteria which decomposes all of these organisms, their dead bodies or their fallen parts, and convert them into different inorganic or organic compounds. And these inorganic and organic compounds are again taken up by, as you see the diagram, the arrow shows that these are taken up by the producers. For example, ammonia, nitrates, and other forms of like phosphorus, sulfur, or others. And all of these are then, of course, present inside the soil. And plants, the producers, they absorb these ingredients from the soil through their roots, and they become part of them. So this is a generalized food chain in a grassland ecosystem. Let us have a look on another example of a food chain we take in an aquatic ecosystem, an ecosystem present in water, a water body. Aquatic ecosystem, first of all, we look at its some properties. Aquatic, present in water. It is marked by water, which is a liquid medium, which is quite good to support life, because we know that temperature is a limiting factor and water changes its temperature slowly. So water is a good medium for supporting life. Water may be fresh water or marine water, that is the saltish water. Fresh water have less salts, have less dissolved salts present in it. A marine water or brackish water have more dissolved salts present in it, or maybe in other forms. A lake, for example, is a fresh water. A sea is a brackish water, a saltish water. Then light and temperature penetration is important in aquatic ecosystems. Light is a very important factor in aquatic ecosystems, because we know that the entry point of energy inside an ecosystem is always the sunlight. So the penetration of light inside the water in an aquatic ecosystem is extremely important. If the water body, a lake, a sea, an ocean, or a pond or a stream, allows a good penetration of light, then photosynthesis is possible and the producers can make energy. If there is lesser penetration of light, then photosynthesis may do not occur. Then the result will be there will be two ways of handling it. One, some organisms which are called chemotrophs, they stay here. Chemotrophs which make their energy and carbohydrates from inorganic sources, but they are fewer. So light penetration is a very important factor in the aquatic ecosystems. And the temperature. Stratification exists in water ecosystems. In the upper layers, usually because they are exposed to sunlight, they have higher temperatures. The lower layers towards the bottom, because they are quite far away from the sunlight, because there is a top layer of water between them and the sunlight, so they are comparatively colder. The life forms which are living in these water bodies depend upon all of these properties. Now we go to a diagram and we look at the aquatic food chains. The organisms which are the producers in an aquatic ecosystem, they may be plant, or they may be called some smaller organisms called phytoplanktons, plant-like organisms. Plants, as we know, they are producers. They convert sunlight into carbohydrates and energy. Phytoplankton are also plant-like organisms. Also some algae, some unicellular organisms. They also have the capability to carry out photosynthesis. Usually in the upper layers of water, the water body, a pond, a lake, an ocean, these organisms are present in abundance. On the shallow sides of the water, in those zones of the water body, for example, a lake where water is shallow, submerged and fully merged plants are present. And these plants carry out photosynthesis. In more deeper regions where the lake is actually deep, these organisms, the phytoplanktons, are present in higher numbers. They have capability to carry out photosynthesis, and they are the entry point of energy in an ecosystem. So there are many phytoplanktons present in those parts in the upper layers of a lake in the deeper region. These phytoplanktons are eaten up by small insects and crustaceans. There are many types of crustaceans, the shrimps, some water insects which are present in these water bodies. They eat upon the phytoplanktons. So phytoplanktons are the producers. These crustaceans and water insects, they are the primary consumers in a water ecosystem food chain. Then these crustaceans and insects, these are themselves consumed by the fish, the primary carnivore fish, different types of fishes. These fishes are themselves eaten up by the carnivore fishes, the large carnivore fishes which eat upon other fishes. So phytoplanktons are producers which carry out photosynthesis, produces organic food. Crustaceans are the primary consumers that eat upon the phytoplanktons. Then fishes are secondary consumers that eat upon the crustaceans or the insects. Then other fishes which eat upon the carnivore fishes, they are the tertiary consumers in a water ecosystem. So this is how a water ecosystem food chain it conducts the flow of energy from producers to the consumers, the primary consumers, the crustaceans, the small insects, the water insects. Then comes the fishes and some other fishes. There could be another food chain that exists in the water ecosystem. For example, phytoplanktons produces the organic food. These are eaten up by the herbivore fishes, the fishes which eat upon the plant matter. And then the herbivore fishes, they are eaten up by the primary carnivore fishes. Then some other fishes comes which eat upon those carnivore fishes which are eating the primary carnivores. They become the tertiary carnivore. So different types of food chains exist in different types of aquatic ecosystems. Now look at an Arctic ecosystem. You know that Arctic ecosystem is very, very cold. Arctic area is full of snow, have a snowfall many times, have very, very colder temperatures. Some specific life forms exist there. We look at a food chain in an Arctic ecosystem. On the base of the food chain, you can see there are algae, which are scattered and present in large numbers. Algae are the organisms which are also producers, which have capability to convert the sunlight into food and into energy in the form of ATP. Then these algae are eaten up by the shrimps. Shrimps are the primary consumers or the herbivores. Shrimps are then eaten up by the codfishes, which are the secondary consumers or the primary carnivores of this ecosystem. Then the seals. Seals eat upon the fishes, these carnivore fishes. So seals, they makes the secondary carnivores. Then comes the polar bears. Polar bears eat upon these seals and they make the tertiary consumer. So this is a food chain present in an Arctic ecosystem. Algae to shrimp, to codfish, to seal, and to a polar bear. Now we are going to talk about food webs. What are the food webs? We say food web. This is a network of eating and being eaten. Food chains are a straight relationship of eating and being eaten, that is of energy flow. But in actuality, when there is an ecosystem and lot many organisms are living in that ecosystem, their relationships are actually much more complex than when exemplified by a simple food chain, that is a straight relationship. For example, if there is a grass plant present in an ecosystem, this may be eaten by a goat. This may also be eaten by a dragonfly. This may also be eaten by a rodent. And then the rodents, they make food for the snakes. Snakes eat the rodents. But rodents are also food of the owls. Owls also eat upon the rodents. Hawks sometimes may also eat the rodents. So the feeding relationships between organisms are actually not as simple as a food chain. There are a lot many food chains that do exist inside the ecosystem, and then these food chains also interact with each other to make a web or a network of the relationship of the living organisms, of feeding, and that is of eating and being eaten by other organisms. So food web is actually a network of eating and being eaten. There are examples, we take certain examples of food webs from different types of ecosystems, from a grassland, forest, from aquatic ecosystem. So food web is basically a network of different organisms which have relationship of eating and being eaten with each other, and these food webs actually consist of interacting food chains. We take an example of a grassland ecosystem. We know that in a grassland ecosystem, there is a diversity of life. There are diverse forms of animals present. There are amphibians, there are reptiles, there are mammals, there are different types of grasses. But grass is eaten by most of the herbivores. There are different types of amphibians which also eat upon the grass. There are many reptiles like many lizards, they also eat upon the grass. So there are a lot many organisms which are eating grass. Grass is a source of energy for all of these organisms. Then these herbivore animals, all of these which are eating the grasses, they are themselves eaten up by more than one carnivores. For example, if there is an amphibian, a frog, it is not eaten up only by a snake. It may also be eaten up by an owl, by a fox. So the relationship becomes complex. Let us have a look on a food web, an example. Look at this diagram. It shows that the grass, which is present in an ecosystem, is eaten up by a grasshopper. The same grass is eaten up by a rabbit, and the same grass is eaten up by a mouse. The arrows shows the direction of energy flow. Then we see that grasshopper itself. So it means that the same grass plant is a source of food for a grasshopper, for a rabbit, for a mouse. Then we can see that the grasshopper itself is a source of food for a lizard, because these lizards, they eat upon these grasshopper. This grasshopper is also a source of food for a hawk. And we can see that the lizard which is eating upon the grasshopper, it is also a source of food for the hawk. So hawk is consuming both the grasshopper and the lizard. Here, if we make two food chains, that is from grass to grasshopper to lizard to hawk, then we see producer, a primary carnivore, a herbivore, then a primary carnivore, the lizard, and then a secondary carnivore, the hawk. If we look at other way, then we can see that grass is eaten up by the grasshopper, and grasshopper is directly eaten up by the hawk. So grasshopper is a herbivore, and which is a primary consumer, and the hawk makes then a secondary consumer and not the tertiary. Then we see that grass is eaten up by rabbit, herbivore, and rabbit is eaten up by the hawk. So it is also a more simple food chain. Then the mouse eats the grass, and mouse is eaten up by the hawk. But there is another way of this food chain, that the grass is eaten up by mouse, mouse is eaten up by the snake, and snake is eaten up by the hawk. So all of these food chains in interaction with each other actually makes the food web, a complex relationship between the living organisms of being eaten and eating someone else. This is one example of a food web in a grassland ecosystem. We look at one more complex example. Here you can see in this diagram that there are producers and decomposers, different types of, and these producers, if we start from producers, then these producers, the plants, which are of various kinds, these are eaten up by different types of organisms. A butterfly, a frog, a bird, a deer, a squirrel, a lot many. And then all of these organisms, or we can say every one of these herbivores, these are all will be called the herbivores, the primary consumers. Every one of these primary consumers are eaten up by more than one secondary consumers, the carnivores. For example, you can see that a raven is eating a butterfly. It is also eating a frog. It is also eating a bird. So secondary consumers, they makes various complex chains with the herbivores, the primary consumers, and with the grasses. Then there are few tertiary consumers. And these tertiary consumers, as you can see, like a bobcat, a big cat, a fox, they are eating different types of secondary consumers. And they are sometimes eating some primary consumers as well. This makes a more complex web of a diversified ecosystem. So if an ecosystem is more diversified in its life forms, that is, it has so many life forms, then the food webs or the feeding relationships present between its living community will be far more complex. So the complexity of a food web actually depends upon the complexity of life and the diversity of life. So more the diversity of life, more the complexity of the food webs. We look at an example of a food web from an aquatic ecosystem. Aquatic ecosystem we know as they are very suitable for life. They are suitable for different types of life forms. So aquatic ecosystems, they have animals, they have plants, they have phytoplanktons, they have zooplanktons, they have decomposers. Their food webs are also usually very complex. Let us have a look on an example. As you can see in this diagram, you can see two zones of water. One is the top zone, the other one is the bottom zone. In the top layer of water, there is more penetration of light. There are different types of phyto and the zooplanktons present. The phytoplanktons are the producers which are utilizing the sunlight and the inorganic carbon, the carbon dioxide, and converting it into organic form of carbon, the food. Then there are different types of fishes and the zooplanktons which are eating upon these different types of phytoplanktons. For example, a fish is eating these phytoplanktons, an insect is eating the phytoplanktons, and then we see that there are other fishes which are eating upon these fishes. We can see a bear which is present in the nearby areas, and this is eating the fish as well, because bears, they also come to the waters and they also hunt the fishes. So you can see that there are different types of food chains that do exist in this ecosystem, the water ecosystem, and they interact with each other, and the same thing is eaten up by many other organisms, and all those organisms, they are eaten up by some other organisms. So in water, also diverse types of food webs, they do exist. Then we take another example of a desert ecosystem. Deserts, as we know, are hot, dry climates. They are hot and they are dry because there is less rainfall. The deserts have few specific plants and few specific animals. Let us have a look on a food web. In this diagram, you can see that there is a sand and soil on the base. Then there are specific types of desert plants. These desert plants, you can see, are eaten up by different types of insects. These plants are also eaten up by the lizards, the reptiles. These are also eaten up by the rodents. And these insects then themselves, because all of these insects, the lizards and the rodents, all of these makes the herbivores or the primary consumers. Then comes the secondary consumers, the spiders, scorpions, different kinds of lizards. They eat upon the insects. Then the lizard, for example, is eaten up by a hawk. The lizard is also eaten up by a fox. Then the herbivore lizards, which eat upon plants, they are eaten up by both fox and the hawk. The rodents, different types of rodents, which are herbivores, which eat upon the plants, they are eaten up by the snakes. They are also eaten up by the hawks and the foxes directly and indirectly. Indirectly in this way, that rodents eats upon plants, snakes eat upon the rodents, and then snakes are eaten up by the foxes and the hawks. So we can say that these rodents are directly eaten by the hawks and the foxes, and they are indirectly through snakes eaten up by the foxes and the hawks. It means that complex relationship of food webs also do exist in the desert ecosystems. Though desert ecosystems are comparatively less diverse in life because these are more hostile environments. But you can see that even these environments, lot many organisms can exist. There's quite a good biodiversity, and this diversity makes the complex relationship of eating and being eaten, which is called a food web. This is another example of a food web in a desert ecosystem, which shows again the producers at the base, as usual, the primary consumers, different types of squirrels, rodents, ants, then secondary and some primary consumers, then tertiary and some secondary consumers, and then tertiary consumers, some secondary consumers, and some quaternary consumers. So food webs actually makes complex relationships between organisms for energy flow. The forest ecosystems are more rich in their biodiversity because they are more suitable for life. You can see in this diagram a relationship in the form of food web between organisms in a forest ecosystem. There are trees which are eaten up by the deers, by insects, by rodents, by birds. Rodents and birds are eaten up by the foxes and the owls. Deers are eaten up by the bears, by large cats. Then the insects, they are eaten up by the birds, they are eaten up by the opossum, and so on. So food webs are the complex networks which mark the relationship of different trophic levels between the organisms of a specific area, of a specific ecosystem. In today's lecture, we talked about the food chains and the food webs. We primarily covered the biotic components of an ecosystem. Then we talked about the food chains, which are the straight relationships of energy flow between the organisms. And we talked about food webs, which are complex forms of energy flow and interaction of the food chains actually present in different types of ecosystem. We also talked about some examples from various ecosystems about their food chains and about their food webs. I hope you understand what we talked about today. We'll meet in the next lecture. Thank you.